I only can do host and discussion.
Sure.
And Peter, you might want to mute your microphone when you're not speaking, just in case there's any background noise.
Okay.
Welcome everyone to the launch of the Climate Transparency Report. We'll just wait one more minute to make sure that everyone has joined who is intending to join, and then we will begin. Hello everyone, and welcome to the launch webinar of the 2022 Climate Transparency Report. Thank you to all of you who are joining to watch this webinar, and thank you to my colleagues who are joining to present the Climate Transparency Report. This is the 8th annual report of the Climate Transparency Initiative, which provides the world's most comprehensive tracking of climate action across G20 countries and members. My name is İpek Gençsu. I'm a senior research fellow at ODI, which is a London-based global affairs think tank and one of the core partners of climate transparency. We work alongside the Berlin Governance Platform, which hosts the Secretariat of Climate Transparency and Climate Analytics. And together, actually, we're a partnership of 19 organizations. You can see all our logos there, working across G20 countries. And we contribute to this report, as well as its dissemination, as well as engagement with policymakers after this launch. In today's webinar, we'll be sharing some of the key findings of the report, which has over 100 indicators tracking just how G20 members are doing in terms of mitigation, adaptation goals, and in terms of aligning their finance with climate goals, and what all of this means in today's challenging context. So we know that just as the world started moving away from COVID, This has been a year where we've seen Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its ramifications globally. We've seen energy prices, food prices, commodity prices increase, and the volatility. We've seen costs of living squeeze. We've seen governments try to cope with that in various ways, including a dash for gas and other fossil fuels. So against this backdrop, today's report looks at the latest comprehensive and comparative data available on pledges and actions by the G20, on emissions, on the impacts of climate change, and on finance flows. So today's webinar will have two main parts. In the first one, we'll look at how G20 governments are doing regarding their climate targets, including net zero goals, mitigation policies, and so on, and the pace of implementation. Are they actually meeting what they said they would be doing? Are they on track with those targets? And we'll also look at the rebound of emissions in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. In the second part, we will turn to the current context of the energy crisis and some of the sort of policy and financing shifts that we need in response to that, to make sure that we retain the possibility of keeping global heating to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels amidst all of this global challenge. Just as a reminder, this is a very short and snappy webinar to fit in with all your busy diaries in the lead up to COP. So there's not likely to be any time for Q&A, but please, by all means, post your questions in the Q&A function, and the relevant researchers will follow up with you afterwards. So now, before we begin presenting on the report, we want to first turn to hear from Peter Eigen, who is the co-founder of Climate Transparency Initiative, and he's also the founder of Transparency International, which most of you will have heard about. To hear from him a reminder of the critical importance and urgency of action on climate change and its impacts that are becoming increasingly stark. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Ipek. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us in this launch of our really important report, which appears at a very crucial time, shortly before decisive international meetings at COP27 and G20 and others, but also at a time of mankind deeply affected by three other crises: the COVID pandemic, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and energy and food crisis. And of course, unfortunately, we experience the effects of climate change now already every day. This week, Nigeria is suffering its worst flooding in a decade. More than 600 people died. 1.4 million people are displaced. 200,000 homes are destroyed. Today in Pakistan, about 1/3 of the land is underwater. And of course, the G20 countries are also affected. In 2022, Australia matched the hottest temperature it ever had recorded, over 50 degrees. Extremely high temperature recorded in the UK. They led to wildfires breaking out in London and across the country. A heat wave in India also saw record heat, which greatly affected workers, labor, migrants, low-income households, and the homeless, and reduced the yields of wheat crops. So the hotter it gets, of course, the more severe the consequences. At present, 10% of the population of Brazil and India will be affected by heat waves. At 3 degrees of warming, 20% of the population in Brazil and 30% of the population of India will be affected. Harvests suffer now and will be more in the future if temperature further increases. Crop yields losses in the United States estimated at 4% of warming at 1.5 degrees, which with an increase by 3 degrees, the losses would go up to 16%. The growing food crisis is alarming. We will have to live with the negative consequences of climate changes for the time being, and those countries which are specifically affected need the help of richer countries. So to prevent the worst, however, we need to strengthen our efforts to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases now. It is not too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for reminding us of the stark reality of climate change, which is really no longer a distant threat that it used to be 10, 20 years ago, but very much part of people's lives at various levels across the world. So let's now turn to our report and understand the role of the G20 within the climate emergency, what the G20 can do differently, what the latest trends are, and how we can shift things to try to avoid the worst and worsening impacts of climate change. So in this first part of the panel, we will hear from Deborah Remilopi, who is the head of policy analysis at Climate Analytics, and followed by Sebastian Wegner, who is from the Climate Transparency Secretariat, and they will speak about, as I mentioned, countries' targets, commitments, policies, and emissions, and in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. So over to you, Deborah, to set us off.
Thank you, Ipek. Hi, everyone. As Ipek said, we are presenting a lot of information within a short space of time. Bear with us as we go through it. I would encourage you to go into the summary report and the 20 country profiles where you can get the details of what we presented today. So my presentation is going to set context of what will follow from my colleagues with details of what is happening at implementation level. So this slide shows the ambition gap in G20 countries. So in a nutshell, it shows that the G20 countries need to increase ambition for both their 2030 targets and at policy and implementation level. We have compared G20 country targets, NDC targets, the 2030 targets that they have promised or they have submitted to the UNFCCC. We have compared that to what should be a 1.5 pathway for each one of the countries. And we have used the information from the 1.5 National Pathways Explorer, which basically looks at least cost pathways. Basically, it evaluates the technological and economic feasibility. It does not assess the fair share aspects of the target, of the fair share target, nor does it assess or evaluate who needs to pay for that. It only shows what needs to be achieved domestically or what is possible domestically in terms of emission reduction. And so the lack of ambition that we are seeing basically in all of these policies and NDC targets, if this picture does not change, we will not be able to reach 1.5. And the current estimates shows that the combined mitigation effects of all 2030 NDC targets, not only just G20, but all NDC targets, will lead to a warming of about 2.4 degrees Celsius by end of the century. So the overall message is simple, is that countries need to increase the ambition, not only of targets, but also policies, and implement those policies. As you know, that targets without implementation are meaningless, and they will not get us to 1.5. Next slide, Sebastian. Okay, this slide shows a summary of G20 net zero targets, which vary, for example, in terms of time frame, coverage of GHGs and the sectors, and how countries plan to reach those targets. What is worth highlighting, and the details are in the report, it's columns 4 and 5 that shows countries that have enshrined their targets in law, and there's only 8 G20 countries. As you know, having this in country legislations gives hope that they will be implemented. And if you look at the 4th column, that shows that most countries plan to partially rely on reductions from outside their borders. Some of the risks that come with that, for example, include double counting of emission reduction. One other important factor to emphasize is that countries need to ensure that their 2030 targets are aligned to net zero targets. So closing the 2030 emissions gap is in both action and ambition. It's quite important for the credibility of these net zero targets. Next slide. Thanks. This slide gives a very high-level summary of what we rate in the report, which is basically policies that G20 countries have or do not have in some cases. Some countries do not have these policies that we rate, aimed at contributing to emission reduction in the country. So as you can see, the overall picture does not look that great. There is a lot of medium and low ratings, which is represented by the colors red and yellow. But there are also some good performers. We have front runners on some of the policies. If you look at the Greens, for example, the UK for renewables in the power generation or power sector, because it has committed to 100% clean electricity by 2035. And we see some countries leading on coal phase out in power generation as well. And this, amongst others, include the UK, France, and Italy. For example, Italy is planning to phase out coal from electricity generation in 2025. This is important for decarbonization of economies. As we know, coal needs to be phased out globally by 2030 in power generation. But we also have some countries not doing well on almost all policies, with either a low or a medium rating. You can see that to your left, to the left of the graph. It's the graph. And examples there, it's Argentina, Australia, and Brazil, but basically dominated by red and yellows. I would really encourage you to go into specific country profiles to get the details. Next slide, Sebastian. Lastly, my slide is a summary of G20 countries' energy mix, which presents a disturbing picture. As you can see, fossil fuels are still dominating the G20 energy mix. You can see with the colors for coal, oil, and gas mostly in the graph, the red theme there, with very little renewables at the top. And to change this trend and decarbonize economies, these countries will need to invest in renewables, which has seen a slight increase to about 10.5% share in 2021 compared to the 2017 share of 9%. Thank you. Over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Deborah. And now, the past always tells us where progress has been made and where we urgently need to accelerate. So if you look at this slide, we can see that in the first year of the corona pandemic, the energy-related CO2 emissions dropped by 4.9% in 2020 compared to 2019, but rebounded by 5.9% in 21 compared to 2020. So we can see here that the plateaued total emissions in the G20 of 2018. After them, we had a dip in COVID. So what we do now is crucial of whether, as Deborah has already outlined, the 2030 targets will be met. And we can see, or you can also see down that at the same time in 2020, the GDP dropped by 3% and increased by 6.1% in 2021. If we look at this at a country level, we can see that after Paris and before the COVID pandemic, the energy-related CO2 emissions dropped by 3%. But the change looks very different in different countries. So we have strongest declines in Mexico, Indonesia, or UK, and strong rebounds in 21, for example, in Brazil, Russia, France, and Italy. And we can illustrate that best, for example, if we look at the power sector being the one with the highest share of the energy-related CO2 emissions in 2021, being 40%. This shows that in 2021, the per capita energy-related CO2 emissions rebounded to above 2020 levels. So being, we have a reduction of 2.8% in 2020 and a rebound of 7.1% in 2021. And this rebound has been, while the increase of the share of renewables in the past have been mostly driven by wind and solar, the rebound was carried mostly by fossils. So the share of the renewables in the power sector stayed at around 28% between 2020 and 2021, and stayed about at 60% of the fossil fuels. And we will hear later from Mariana Gutierrez of what should be done about it. And if we look at the country level here, we can see that the change depends a lot on the country context and a lot of on the renewable share of the renewables used. For example, you can see here down that in Brazil, the rebound in 2021 to your left down was very strong. This was based on a drought in Brazil, where they couldn't really use the large hydro anymore. So that's why the per capita emissions in electricity generation jumped up so high. And if you look at France next to Brazil, we can see that the rebound was not as strong because it was carried by nuclear. So you can look into the report. The rebounds look quite different in different countries, depending on the country level. But bottom line, as Deborah outlined, renewables are key to have this picture looking a lot more positive and where we need to go. And the rebound itself, it looked quite different in different sectors. Just one example, so you find more sectors in our report, but looking at the slower rebound in the transport sector, on the negative side, we can really see that the transport emissions continue to grow. Between Paris and before the COVID pandemic, we had a growth of 6% across the G20 countries. yeah, and even but like the rebounds in Turkey and China went really above the 2020 levels. Yeah, if you want to know more also about the building sector, industry, land use, and forestry, look into the report. And with that, I'm handing back to IPEC to lead us into this solutions part. Back to you, IPEC.
Thank you very much. And I know it's a really hard job condensing the wealth of and the depth of the report into a 10-minute presentation. So thank you very much for presenting the targets and where the G20 ambitions lie, to what extent these are themselves ambitious, but also really the disheartening assessment that the overall mitigation policies are not adequate across the board, and the absolute domination of the energy mix by fossil fuels. I mean, that graph is really, it's something that, you know, despite all our efforts on renewables, we are just not getting there fast enough. And finally, the rebound of emissions in 2020 to pre-pandemic levels, when we were hoping that some of that downturn during the pandemic might stick. So what lessons can we learn from that at country level and at sectoral level going forward? It's really key. So please, everyone, do have a look at your country's own country profiles, but also at some of the sectoral assessment in the report as well. So in the second part of the webinar, we'll look at the impact of the energy crisis. Obviously, this is much more recent, and how that will play out, and some of the developments that we're already seeing in response to the energy crisis, and what are the policy and finance shifts that are crucial now to make sure that we can bend the emissions curve, and to make sure that we don't lock into further higher levels of fossil fuels and levels of climate impacts, which will be very challenging to adapt to. So let me introduce Mariana Gutierrez, who is a coordinator in the Climate Transparency Secretariat, and she was formerly at the Climate Initiative of Mexico, ICM, one of the climate transparency partners. And also my colleague Archie Gilmore, who's a researcher in the climate and sustainability team at ODI together with me, and has been leading on the finance research of the report. So over to you, Mariana, to talk us through what the energy crisis means for us and the G20.
Sure. Thank you, IPEC. Hello, everyone. So concerning the energy crisis, at the close of 2021, fossil fuel prices like oil and gas rose, further increasing after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Also, the energy security topics gained major attention in combination with the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, the climate emergency had a secondary level of importance. Next slide, please. So what has been the G20 response to the energy crisis, and how does it affect the climate? As a response to the energy crisis, some G20 governments have taken on ad hoc measures, which has had negative and positive implications for the climate. So on the negative side, short-term solutions to guarantee energy supply, such as fossil fuel subsidies and price caps, delay climate action. In Germany, for instance, the discussion concerning the CO2 tax will be deferred to 2024. Also, decisions to continue investing and promoting fossil fuels will lead to a major dependence on fossils and a carbon lock-in. Some concrete examples include fracking in the UK and tar sands exploration in Canada. On the positive side, however, renewables became cheaper even than the lowest cost fossil fuel alternative. Second, renewable deployment increased in the European Union, South Africa, and the US. Carbon pricing mechanisms like the one of China could lead to positive implications. And also the skyrocketing prices have brought to the center of the discussion the importance of conserving energy. Next slide, please. So energy-related CO2 emissions represent more than 3/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions of the G20. So for that reason, the decarbonization of the energy sector by prioritizing renewables and phasing out fossil fuels is critical for a 1.5-degree scenario. Specifically, the electricity sector contributes with 40% of the sector's emissions. From 2015 to 2019, the share of renewables for electricity generation has increased across most G20 countries, except for Mexico and Italy, which show a decreasing trend. In 2020, the share increased in most countries, but it dropped again in 2021. And the good news is that the competitiveness of renewables has been growing since 2010. In 2021, for instance, the newly added renewable costs were lower than the cheapest coal-fired plant. So now the million-dollar question is how to move forward with more ambitious and effective climate action amidst the various crises. So now I will hand it over to Ipek and Archie, who will talk about climate finance.
Thanks, Mariana. So we know what we have to do. We need massive investment in renewables and energy efficiency measures, and we need massive investment to adapt to the impacts of climate change and shield the most vulnerable. But instead, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars propping up the fossil fuel industry, encouraging new production, encouraging excessive consumption of fossil fuels. As though the problem were not already challenging enough, we're distorting the market and making renewables less competitive. G20 members provided at least $147 billion in subsidies to coal, oil, and gas in 2020. And that's according to self-reported data published by the OECD. China, Indonesia, and the UK led the field. So subsidies here refer specifically to tax exemptions and budgetary transfers, which means that they're likely underestimate the level of support to fossil fuels. And although country-level data for 2021 is not yet available, the OECD has published figures for the G20 in aggregate, which suggest that subsidies to fossil fuels rose by almost 30% to $190 billion. This included the most support to producers ever recorded by the OECD, $64 billion, to protect supplies from lower demand during COVID lockdowns. This trend will likely be worse for 2022. Soaring energy prices, due in part to the war in Ukraine, would have meant that many existing subsidies that fluctuate with prices would have increased anyway. And that's before the unprecedented price caps being put in place across Europe to support consumers. So it's crucial that we don't put blanket long-term measures in place, but instead that we use targeted support to the vulnerable and invest in renewable energy structures and energy efficiency. So public finance here means national and multilateral development banks and export credit agencies. Data is only available for 2019 to 2020, when $62 billion each year went to fossil fuels, especially from Japan, South Korea, and China. By comparison, G20 members provided less than $20 billion to clean energy projects, and about $18 billion to non-fossil fuel projects, which include transmission lines, and other energy infrastructure, large-scale hydro, and also nuclear. Now, at COP26, 39 countries and public finance institutions committed to end all overseas finance for fossil fuels. However, they allow exceptions in limited circumstances, particularly for fossil gas investments, and it remains unclear what will count as exceptions. What's more, none of the biggest contributors to public finance for fossil fuels have signed up to this commitment. So clearly this needs to end. Subsidies and finance for fossil fuels need to end. On top of that, we need massive investment in climate action. Trillions of dollars will be required just to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And more is needed to adapt to a changing world. No country is currently mobilizing anywhere near enough. In 2009, developed countries agreed to provide $100 billion annually in climate finance to developing countries by 2020. And this target was clearly insufficient, massively insufficient. But because no accountability for reaching this goal was agreed, even this has never been met. ODI research looks at what might be the fair share of Annex II countries, the developed countries, based on historic emissions, the size of each economy, and population size. That is, fair share to this $100 billion goal. According to this methodology, Annex II countries in the G20 should be contributing $87 billion out of the $100 billion. Most do not reach their fair share of even this meager target. The USA in particular stands out starkly, having contributed only 5% of its fair share. Germany, Japan, and France are the only ones that surpassed their fair share in 2020, but even this is problematic because much of the finance came in the form of loans rather than grants. So even though most of this finance data is from before the energy crisis, which has changed much and puts us in a very tough situation, I think it demonstrates the scale of our climate action before the tough situation. We cannot backslide on what little progress has been made. Instead, we need to commit unequivocally to the task at hand. But I'll pass over to Ipek for some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Mariana and Archie, for summarizing some of the challenges brought about by the energy crisis and the ongoing support that governments provide to fossil fuels, while the international support for climate action is clearly very inadequate. So we are about to run out of time for this time allocated to share our key findings with you, but I just wanted to leave you all with some concluding points and key actions that the G20 can take. So we need to make sure that the response to the energy crisis, both domestically and internationally, does not undermine climate action. It does not lock in fossil fuel production and consumption and lead to stranded assets. So we know, of course, we need to support the most vulnerable to protect them from the cost of living crisis and the energy crisis. But we can target that support much better to those who need it while we promote energy conservation and energy efficiency and the switching to renewables, use this opportunity to really put much more backing behind renewables. And across the board, something we haven't discussed today, but it's also in the report, is that we need to extend carbon pricing mechanisms, make sure that the prices are gradually increasing and that the coverage is increasing in line with, again, what 1.5 degree warming requires. And also we continue to disclose climate risk across G20 countries as well. And we need to finally expand the quality and the quantity of climate finance to make sure that we are supporting mitigation and adaptation efforts in countries that have not been historically responsible, but do need a lot of support to make sure that we are globally able to address this major challenge. So if you have any further questions or remarks about the report, please do feel to reach out to researchers and we will put you in touch with the relevant researchers working on that topic or country. Please do get in touch with us through our email address, and also feel free to delve into the reports yourselves. Thanks for making the time today out of your busy days to join us, and we look forward to connecting with you all. Thank you.